Good morning. I'd like to start and bring greetings to the people of this church, where Loretta de Braose was anchoress, from the people of St Mary the Virgin, Iffley, where her sister Honora was enclosed. And I was glad to see on the screen a familiar face, Sarah McKerney, who's our vicar's wife. I'm talking about anchorites. And I want to start with a definition because Sarah Maitland, who follows me, is talking about hermits, so we had to agree a division between our subjects. So what is an anchorite? The main division in types of traditional Christian religious life is between those whose members live in community, monks, nuns, friars, and those who live a largely solitary life. By Loretta's time, these solitaries, or recluses, had been classed as either anchorites or hermits. The difference was that anchorites lived an enclosed life in their cell, which they were not allowed to leave without permission from their bishop, unless it was essential to save life. On the other hand, hermits were able to move around. Indeed, many of them made a living by maintaining roads or bridges or operating ferries, or had a preaching mission. So where did this come from? All the traditional forms of religious life come from the same source, the desert fathers and mothers in the early centuries of Christianity. Beginning in the 4th century, at the time of the great persecution of Christians under Diocletian, but then flourishing after the time Christianity became the established religion of the Roman Empire in 313, men and women moved into caves or deserted buildings in the desert which edged the inhabited areas in Egypt and Syria to live a solitary life dedicated to prayer. They often supported themselves by manual work, in particular using palm leaves to make baskets. Scriptural support for this way of life was found in the life of John the Baptist, and that Jesus spent 40 days in the desert immediately after his baptism. The contemplative also looked to the story of Mary and Martha in Luke's Gospel to justify their choice. Mary has chosen what is better. Possible explanations people have come up with for why this movement grew so rapidly in the period shortly after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire are the increasing worldliness of the church and the removal of martyrdom as the ideal to which dedicated Christians aspired. The movement became widely known through the writings of Cassian in the 5th century. He and others collected short stories about these men and women. They also collected short statements that these desert hermits had made, known as sayings. Many of these sayings were addressed to their disciples, those wishing to follow the desert life who attached themselves as students to a desert father or mother known for holiness. Other sayings were given to those who came from the outside world seeking spiritual guidance, both clerical and lay. They are evidence that these desert dwellers were widely valued for wisdom and spiritual advice. One of the interesting characters whose actions and sayings were recorded was Abba Moses. He was an escaped African slave, certainly black and probably a Nubian, who had become a robber. After his conversion later in life, he became a monk and was ordained. Stories about him show an attractive humility and sense of humor. One of his best-known sayings was to a young monk who was finding his new life a struggle. "Go, sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything." This is the foundation of the anchoritic life. We know that the early recluses were a major inspiration for the anchoritic movement. In about 1160, Alred of Rievaulx wrote a rule for his anchoress sister which expressly stated that the lives of the desert fathers were the model for the life she led. There's also evidence that the earliest hermits in many parts of Europe were inspired by the accounts of the lives of desert fathers and mothers. Although some of these hermits lived enclosed in cells, no distinction was made between them and the hermits who moved about and did outside work and preaching. The distinction began to be made in the 12th century when there was a great growth in religious fervor, particularly among religious lay people, which resulted in new forms of religious life. Some historians link this to the gradual breakdown of the feudal system and the growth of urban and mercantile life at this time. For many laywomen, the established religious life of a nun was not open to them because there was usually a significant financial contribution for entering a convent, the provision of a dowry of land or money. As a result, nuns were usually from aristocratic or wealthy families. Some of these new religious movements, such as the Franciscans and Dominicans, were officially approved, developed standards of life, rules of life, and became largely clericalized. Others, like the Beguines and the Waldensians, remained lay and were viewed with suspicion by the church establishment. Although some hermits and anchorites were clerics under the control of the church, or monks and nuns whose lives continued to be governed by the rules of their order, increasingly they were lay men and women. There were no established and approved rules of life governing them, which is one reason why we have a body of literature written by priests or senior monks giving advice as to how they should live. This change in society is also reflected in the locations of hermits and anchorites. In the early Middle Ages, the period from the 5th to the 10th centuries, they imitated the desert movement by usually living in remote areas. Forests and islands were popular locations. As more monks and nuns entered the solitary life, they tended to have cells in or close to the monastery, which itself would be located away from settled communities. However, in the late 12th and early 13th century, the period in which both Loretta and Loretta de Braose became anchorites, the trend was for cells of anchorites to be attached to churches or chapels in towns and villages. Both sisters chose churches which at that time were outside but close to major conurbations. Some hermits became urban dwellers, but many remained in remote locations. So why would you choose to be an anchorite? Most people today, told that anchorites were voluntary, shut in a cell for the rest of their lives, react in horror. Why would somebody, unless seriously mentally ill, choose such a life? However, even a quick reading of the writings of the 14th century English anchoress, Julian of Norwich, reveals a woman who is mature, wise, and balanced, and clearly not suffering from some psychological pathology. In trying to understand why so many people, including our noble anchoresses, Loretta and Nora, chose this life, we must first understand how different our culture and religion and philosophical outlook is from those of our medieval ancestors. For this audience, I'll start with the religious outlook. For medieval people, heaven, hell, and purgatory were very real. Life was short and death was always present. So having in your community someone whose life was dedicated to prayer and who you believed could effectively pray for you and your deceased relatives to shorten the sufferings of purgatory was very desirable. In return, you earned spiritual merit and shortening of the time in purgatory by giving material support to that person. This attitude is mainly evidenced in England by the many wills and charters providing gifts to specified anchorites in return for prayers for the donor's soul, particularly in the urban societies of the 13th century onwards. Indeed, the only evidence we have that Nora's anchor hold was in Italy is the official records of regular gifts of firewood to her from Henry III. The records of his reign show that he supported many other anchorites, either with money or gifts. Another reason for becoming an anchorite was that asceticism was regarded as the highest form of religious life and the best route to holiness, so those who adopted this extremely strict form of religious life were regarded with admiration, even awe, by their communities. The second major difference between us and our medieval ancestors comes from the Enlightenment, which brought the prevailing Western view of the importance of the individual. This gave rise to the ideas of universal human rights and democracy, but also to an attitude that my rights are more important than the good of my community. However, for most of human history, the community has been paramount, the individual only recognized as a member of that community. Asked to identify themselves, medieval people would refer to their family, village, the local lord of the area, perhaps their county or country. One aspect of this culture was the practice of giving one of your children, whilst still very young, to a local monastery or convent as a child oblate. This was done for the good of the family. The parents would have been puzzled if they'd been asked whether that was what the child wanted, because the child's wishes had no relevance. The same was true of marriage, at least in the upper classes. Their father had made matches very advantageous to the family for both Loretta and Honora. It is unlikely they had any say in the matter. As we have seen, family and community was seen to benefit from one of their members becoming an anchorite. There were also practical advantages, at least for some, for becoming an anchorite. By the 12th century, the process was controlled by the bishop, who was responsible for ensuring that the enclosed recluse did not starve and that they behaved well. As a result, a person wanting to become an anchorite had to prove that they had sufficient support for their needs and would be interviewed by the bishop or a senior churchman appointed by the bishop to ensure that they had a real vocation to this calling. Whilst Honora and Loretta had their own income and wealthy contacts, we do have records of poor childless widows seeking to become anchorites as a way of ensuring support for the rest of their lives. There are also several examples of the maid of an anchoress succeeding her dead mistress as an anchoress in the same cell, possibly also as a means of support. So why did Loretta and Honora make this choice? It's possible that their life experiences had a role. One popular option for a noble widow, particularly one who was childless as both sisters were, was to enter a convent. Through their mother's family, Honora and Loretta were closely connected to the leading Benedictine convent at Godstow near Oxford, of the Fair Rosamond fame, and their sister Flandrina was a nun there. They both had ample means for a dowry. So, entering Godstow would have been possible for either of them once they had decided on a religious life after becoming a widow. Instead of a fairly comfortable life in a wealthy convent, both sisters instead chose a much more austere life of permanent enclosure and anchor hold. Neither of them has left us any documentary record of why they made this choice, so we have to look for clues in their pre-enclosed lives. One reason why the life of an anchoress might seem preferable to that of a nun is the anchoress had more independence. A nun's life was ruled in all aspects by the rule followed by her order, so any woman like Loretta or Honora who had been in charge of extensive noble households would not find that easy. Further, nuns owed strict obedience to the abbess. If the sisters had in any degree inherited their mother's recorded independence and strong-mindedness, and there certainly seems to be signs that Loretta did, such obedience would have been particularly difficult to contemplate. Another reason could be that the anchoress retained more ability to communicate with people in the outside world than most nuns. We know that Loretta had dealings with the world outside her cell, most notably in her patronage of the first Franciscan friars to arrive in England and the request from Henry III for information about the earldom of Leicester. These seem to indicate that she retained a reputation and some influence in the ruling elite during her long years as a recluse. These reasons could apply to any noble woman called to the religious life. However, in the case of Loretta and Honora, their life experiences point to some other reasons why they may have chosen the anchoritic life over the aristocratic convent. These relate to the inherent liminality of the anchorite at the boundaries between professed religions and laity, and between the almost complete enclosure of the nun and enclosure with continuing contacts with the world outside the anchor hold. The sisters almost certainly grew up in the Welsh Marches, which, like any political and geographical border, was inherently liminal. This was particularly the case during their childhood, a period when there was almost constant warfare and violence between the Norman lords, which included their father, and the native Welsh princes, and between the neighbouring Norman lords. The area of their upbringing may also have affected their choice. Herefordshire, where they probably spent much of their childhood, and where Honora's husband was based, is an area where there was a concentration of anchorites at that time. Anchoring Vissa, a medieval guide to anchorites I'll discuss later, was most probably written in this area the early part of the 13th century, possibly around the time Loretta was entering her anchor hold. At least one scholar thinks the work was made under the patronage of Honora's husband, and that Loretta could have influenced its composition, and that Honora must have known of it, and the French translation could have been made for her when she decided to become an anchoress. The precipitous fall from power of their father when King John turned against him was another liminal experience. It was certainly true for Honora, imprisoned by John for 4 years from 1210 to 1214, perhaps in the same castle where her mother and eldest brother were locked in a dungeon and left to starve to death in 1210. Even if she was in captivity elsewhere, she must have known of their end and had her own perilous situation constantly in mind. Loretta's liminal experience over the same period was of an exile in France, stripped of all her property. She almost certainly would have been with her father when he died, a broken man, in France in September 1211. The terrible fate of their parents provides another potential reason for the sisters to choose to become anchoresses. Tom Lysons, in his book Hermits and Recluses in English Society, suggests that one of the reasons for the considerable increase in the numbers of hermits and anchorites in the long 11th century was the increased emphasis by the church in that period on the dangers of sin and the need for penance. Both sisters could well have thought that the downfall of their family was a punishment from God and could have suffered the guilt often felt by survivors of a catastrophe, both things necessitating penance. A major role expected of anchorites was to be intercessors for their sponsor and other peoples who asked for their prayers, but License in the same book gives evidence that their primary prayer concerns were for their family and close friends. The sisters would have felt it very necessary to pray for the souls of their parents and their eldest brother, particularly because the circumstances of the death of their mother and brother makes it certain that they died unshrived. Their eldest sister, Margaret, was granted land by the dying King John for religious foundation at Anchorite in Herefordshire. The grant states that Margaret could found a convent to pray for the souls of her parents and her eldest brother, which she did. I like to think that was a slight admission of conscience by John. In a convent, Loretta and Honora would have been obliged to pray for the souls of all the many patrons and benefactors of that house. In their anchor holds, they could concentrate on praying for their family. Now, what was life like for Loretta? Because they didn't have a specific rule of life, we don't know for certain how Loretta and Honora passed their days in their cells. As I've already mentioned, there were a number of guides written by clergymen for anchorites who are not members of an established religious order, which provide a lot of detailed rules. However, the hermeneutic of suspicion applies as much to the study of these guides as it does to biblical studies. Are these counsels of perfection, or perhaps an attempt to exert some ecclesiastical control? Do their prohibitions show what the actual behavior was of some anchorites which the writer deemed unsuitable? One example could be the detailed prohibitions in anchoring vissa related to speech, which include the anchoress talking too long at her outside window, gossiping, or usurping the role of the priest by giving spiritual advice to a man. She could advise women. For instance, we know that Marjorie Kemp consulted Julian Norwich. And she has given detailed instructions as to how to instruct her maid on practical and spiritual issues. As I've said before, we have reason to believe that anchoring vissa was known to both Loretta and Honora, and they may very well have had copies in their cells. Now, I'm not an expert on this book, but I know that a real expert, my friend Kate Gunn, who's here, has agreed to come speak to you next year. The author of Anchorite vissa divides his device into two categories, the inner and the outer rule. In the introduction, he states he's divided the work into 8 sections, which he called books, 7 dealings with the inner rule, and the last with the outer rule. First chapter deals with devotions, providing a daily pattern of prayer. This was lengthy and rigorous. Alicia Smith, who I've also seen on the Zoom screen, when she was a doctoral student at Oxford, followed the program for a day and found that almost 6 hours were spent in prayer. I've talked to her about it. She told me that she needed the afternoon nap that anchoring vissa suggests and was exhausted by bedtime. The next 6 chapters provide a lot of advice on temptations and how to avoid them, confession and penance, purifying the heart, and growing in love for God. Last chapter gives a lot of practical advice on food, clothing, hygiene, getting enough rest, as well as dealing with maids and visitors. Anchoresses are told not to keep any animals or livestock unless strictly necessary, but they can have a cat. It doesn't say whether that is as a pet or to keep the rats and mice down. She should not be idle, can make her own clothes and ecclesiastical garments, but should not run a school or trading business. After the 13th century, after Loretta's time, the story of the Anchoritic movement is considerable growth in the 13th and to the 15th century, followed by rapid termination under Henry VIII at the time of the dissolution of the monasteries. Most of that growth took place in urban contexts, not surprising as this was a period of expansion of English towns and cities and the growth of the urban economy. There were more female than male anchorites during this period, although the relative proportions varied over time. Most of the male anchorites were clerics from a range of social classes. The women were generally unmarried. This was one route for a woman who wished to avoid marriage, but there were also widows who wished to avoid remarriage. There are a few recorded cases where a married person became an anchorite, not necessarily with the consent of the other spouse. The removal of anchor holds seems to be more of a byproduct of the dissolution of the monasteries and chantry chapels under Henry VIII than a separate policy of eliminating anchorites, although in some places that was definitely carried out. But anyway, it had the same effect. More substantial cells were stripped of lead and other valuable minerals. Some anchorites attached to parish churches managed to stay on by paying rent. The records indicate that some anchorites who had been maintained by specific families or organizations were paid pensions after they had to leave their cells, but doubtless others were made destitute. Now, turning to anchoritism today, certainly not very many anchorites, but there was a revival of English anchoritism in the 20th century at the Anglican shrine in Walsingham. At various times, 3 women were separately enclosed in various buildings on the site. None of them are still there today. However, I did a Google search, and that reveals there are still few anchorites today. One, an Anglican called Sister Ruth, is a very modern anchorite. She has a website, www.anchorhold.co.uk, which I recommend looking at, on which she gives information about her daily routine and her work. So what lessons for today? Well, this would have been a rather different talk 2 years ago, but thanks to the pandemic, we've all now had a little taste of anchoritic life. Shut in our homes, watching our church services through our little window of the anchorite of a screen by means of Zoom or live streaming, speaking to others at a distance, face covered. There is some useful information or advice in anchoring visa we could use, such as disciplined use of time, regular prayer, getting enough rest, eating sensibly, wearing comfortable clothing. As we all know, we've all resorted to much more comfortable clothing during this time. And perhaps we could get a cat, and as we know, a lot of people have adopted pets. The pandemic, particularly in the early phase before vaccines were developed, meant our lives had much in common with the lives of our medieval ancestors who regularly experienced mass outbreaks of disease. We all know about the terrible effects of the bubonic plague, known as the Black Death, but there were also widespread deadly outbreaks of cholera and smallpox. The difference for us is the result of the scientific revolution, which really got going in the 16th and 17th centuries. We know what causes these diseases and have developed treatments for many of them. To our ancestors, these pandemics could only be explained as a manifestation of God's anger against the community, which had to be propitiated in some way. Of course, we are still partly to blame. Science indicates that many epidemics, such as Ebola and COVID, are at least a part the result of human activity, which caused the virus to cross from animals to humans. Perhaps this time of pandemic has been teaching us the wisdom of what Abba Moses said: "Go, sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything." That means if you can't find God where you are, you will not find him by rushing around or going somewhere else, thinking that there is a holier place where it is easier to be closer to God. I'm not suggesting we should return to the medieval life of anchorites, not leaving home for the rest of our lives. However, there are lessons from that life for us today, still in the grip of COVID. Rather than concentrating on what we could not, and to some extent still cannot, do because of the pandemic, we should grasp the gifts it has given us. When I was a child at school, we learned the poem by Welsh poet W.H. Davies, which begins, what is this life if full of care? We have no time to stand and stare, no time to stand beneath the boughs and stare as long as sheep or cows. We've been given time to stand and stare. Let's not waste it.